لو تخينا مسس كنو فلنا نفريه بنا كنتبع لنا سبسي أي تفرحي نحق فرح نزقيه فرحي
Hello.
Good evening, everybody. Morning, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Maiza Gidey. I am a member of the Tigray Advisory Council in the North America, amongst other organizations. Today, we are organizing this panel discussion as part of a series of panel discussion that we have put out in commemoration of the 2 years of the ongoing Tigray genocide. We have incredibly distinguished guest speakers today who will talk about exclusively on the role of the Eritrean state on the ongoing conflict in Tigray. Today's discussion will be moderated by Markab Nagash. I will present a brief introduction regarding him once he joins this room. Give us a few minutes until all of our guests are here and we'll start officially. In the meantime, we ask everybody to share this space with relevant members of the international community, journalists, policymakers, as well as academic institutions, so that they learn from these experts about the involvement of Eritrea, how that reflects or affects the national interest of not only of members of the Tigray community, but also Eritrea itself. So we're truly grateful that so many people are already here. As I said, we have incredibly knowledgeable line of speakers that will share their opinion based on their expertise. So we encourage everybody to go ahead and share this space and tag all relevant actors that you think will benefit from listening to this conversation. In the meantime, I see Mr. Martin. Thank you so much for being here. I see Professor Mirjam. We're waiting on Markab, the moderator, as well as Professor Kjetil. So I ask you all to please send a request so that I can bring you up as a speaker. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you for your patience. Like I said, today's discussion is part of it's part of a Twitter series the Tigray Advisory Council in North America has put together. The main purpose of this Twitter series is to bring an educated discussion to members of the international community so that they have a clear understanding of what's happening, why, and what should be done in order to end the suffering of the innocent people, not only in Tigray and Eritrea, but also in Ethiopia. Today's discussion will exclusively focus on Eritrea's role in the Tigray genocide, and we have a lineup of incredible speakers alongside our moderator, Markab Nagash. I will formally introduce all of them once all of our speakers are on the stage. I appreciate your understanding and patience, and kindly ask everybody to please continue to share this space and tag journalists as well as policymakers so that they can hear an informed and objective opinion on the topic from experts that have worked on the issue of Eritrea for so many years. We already have Merkab on stage, so I'll go ahead and introduce Merkab. In the meantime, both of our speakers will join us. Merkab Nagash is um, he is a student of political science and international relations. He taught peace and security studies at the Jimma University between the year of 2008 and 2014. Then he worked as an Ethiopian diplomat in Addis Ababa and then in Brussels between the year of 2014 all the way to August 2021. Merkab is also, he has an experience working at the Prime Minister's office as a senior policy expert in Ethiopia for less than a year in 2018. But Merkab, most importantly, is from Tigray and he's an incredible human being. So thank you so much, Merkab, for for giving us your time to moderate today's discussion. We're truly grateful. I will pass the stage to you, but I think we can wait a few more minutes until both of our speakers can join the stage. But in the meantime, I would like to inform everybody that this is a respectful space. I kindly ask everyone to be respectful towards one another. And if you have any specific questions that you would like our speakers to address, please feel free to write it on the chat box and we'll present it to them. Thank you so much. Merkab, take it over.
Going on
with Ethiopia.
Fought for 30 years in
one relationships between Tigray and Eritrea, the TPLF, EPLF one, and now we are discussing the period between 1991, 1993 up to 1998, 2000. So I will just give back mic to you. I have introduced you, but it would also be fair if you just briefly introduce yourself and proceed. And thank you for joining us.
Salam Merkab and Salam Measa. I'm terribly sorry. It was some confusion with daylight saving time. We just changed the time here in Norway, so I thought it was at 8 p.m. Norwegian time, not 7. So I'm sorry for joining you late. I apologize for that. Yes, the relationship between Eritrea and Tigray, or EPLF, TPLF, Isaias and Meles at that time, I think, and I'm sure you have discussed that then when you have taken the pre-independence period, and the trouble which were occurring between the two fronts from 84, 85 and onwards, which was never really reconciled, although when they went from a strategic to a tactical relationship in 88. That kind of ideological differences, the differences of doctrines of interpreting communism, basically, wasn't reconciled in 1991 when they achieved the military liberation of Eritrean territories. Neither was it reconciled in 93 with the formal independence of Eritrea. Although you had the signing of the Asmara Pact, the bilateral agreements regulating relationship between the independent Eritrea and the rump state of Ethiopia in 1993, we saw rather immediate when it came to the implementation of that bilateral framework that it was not implemented according to the letter of the agreement. And I think that's some of the early basic flaws which came back to haunt the relationship, which then eventually turned into an open war again in 1998. The reason why the formalization of the bilateral relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia didn't occur, it's probably a complex answer to that, but I think the key issue here is that although Eritrea fought for 30 years in a devastating war of independence, the key leadership of EPLF, meaning in particular Isaias Afwerki himself, achieving independence was never not a sign that he wanted to depart Ethiopian politics, so to say. He still wanted to play a role in the Horn of Africa as such, but certainly also play a role in Ethiopian political development and Ethiopian domestic affairs. We saw it very early on when it came to the economic interference, you might say, or economic involvement of Eritrean public businesses in Ethiopian economy. But you also saw his interest to undermine, you might say, and Isaias was very explicit on that very early on, undermine the ethnic federal system the EPRDF wanted to implement in Ethiopia. Already in 93, 94, he said this was a house of cards which eventually would fall. And particularly he was worried that the ethnic federalism would have a spillover effect to Eritrea to encourage particularly the Afar, but also other Western lowland groups that their demand, so to say, for cultural political autonomy would undermine his vision of a unitary nationalistic ideological policy which he wanted to implement. The gradual weakening and non-implementation of the Asmara Pact eventually, as you know, led to the outbreak of a new war, which basically was premised on both economic interest, ideological interest, and most importantly, in my view, power interest, who were the determining political force in shaping Horn of African politics. Should it be Meles or should it be Isaias? The territorial issue of that dispute was just an expression of these deeper economic, political, ideological differences. And that's a tragedy that this wasn't noticed and acted upon earlier, both by Eritrean political elite surrounding Isaias, but also then TPLF, EPRDF in Ethiopia. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Trenvoll. I think one of the most interesting things that has been now raised by Professor Trenvoll is also the kind of economic cooperation agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, if I'm not mistaken, that was signed in 1993. And how that also created a kind of a complicated relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the role of Eritrea within Ethiopia and all. And even in 2018, as you might remember, the Eritreans were really interested in just bringing back that agreement and, you know, negotiate a kind of a new political dispensation vis-a-vis its relations with Ethiopia. I'm not part of the speakers, so I'm not going to give my opinions on these issues. But I would also want you all to highlight at least the foreign policy of Eritrea since independence, not only vis-a-vis Tigray, Ethiopia, but also in the region, the kind of relations it has had with Sudan, with Yemen, with Ethiopia, and others. I think back to you, Mr. Plaut or Professor Trenvoll, and then
Well, I mean, one of the things that Isaias has, always been prepared to do was to reach out and have one hell of a bust up with his neighbors. I mean, there's hardly a single country in the neighborhood that he hasn't had a fight with or sent troops to. I mean, he's involved himself in Sudan. He's got a current dispute going on with Djibouti. He had a brief flare-up with Yemen over the Hanish Islands. He intervened in Somalia in order to bolster the Islamic courts and then Al-Shabaab. As well as we've mentioned, having one war and lots of interference with the situation in Ethiopia and supporting various groups at various times who were trying to undermine the Ethiopian state. But I mean, this is the way he expresses himself, and the way that he doesn't see himself simply as a politician who has a relationship with, who's from a small country of 4, 5, maybe 6 million people, but he sees himself, as I said, like a giant in the Horn of Africa, and wants to show that he can influence your life and change it substantially, he thinks he can bring about regime change. He sees himself as a long-term thinker, someone who thinks very deeply about issues and then acts upon those by pulling the right strings in order to do it. And he at home he has total control through the most intensive system of spying and repression, and he extends that, but particularly in neighboring states, but across the world. I mean, if you are an Eritrean living in, I don't know, Germany or Sweden or in Britain, you will find people putting pressure on you if you don't behave the way that you want to. So I mean, he's like a spider at the middle of this web, extending his power in any way that he can. And I don't want to overemphasize the singularity of one man in a extremely complex Horn of Africa. But I'm afraid sometimes you have to acknowledge that if it hadn't been for the peculiar nature of his personality and his ability to understand things and to then act with utter ruthlessness in projecting his power, you really can't understand what's going on.
Yes, thank you. If you might want to add something on that, Professor Trenvoll, or Professor Mirjam as well.
Well, I mean, I think that the problem is a little bit in the kind of the framing of the question, in the sense of, is Eritrea led by something that looks like a government? And in that sense, does it have a policy? And well, I don't really think that it does. I think that the way I see it is that this has really never properly transformed into into something that can be called a country and can be called a government. I mean, one of the things that I found really striking was when I realized that the Minister of Finance or anyone in the government doesn't really have any budget or doesn't have any portfolio. So everything goes back to this cell around Isaias, which runs it as a corporation, and a corporation that doesn't abide to any international rules. So I think that I find it problematic if we ask the questions in such a way as if Isaias would be operating on the basis of the rules of the international system. I don't think that he does. I don't think that he thinks he does. And I don't think that he thinks he needs to do so. So the question that I always ask myself is, what is driving him to operate in this way, to operate in a way where he basically has taken the whole population inside and outside as of his own, which again is also not according to any international rule or law or logic. And so what I'm trying to really understand is what is his logic in how he sees himself operate in the world. And to me, that is not a logic that is based on how does one country relate to the other countries in foreign policy or whatever. No, he has his influence everywhere, in the Horn, in Africa, in Europe, in any continent where there are Eritreans, and in any continent where there is business that he relates to. And so in that sense, Actualia is not originally from me. I think it should be attributed to Martin, that it's a mafia organization that uses the institutions of the state to really pursue other goals. And I think it's important to say that, because if we keep on talking about it as if this is a normal country with a normal government and a normal state, I think we are asking the wrong questions, and therefore we can't really get to the core of the problem. That is how I see it.
Interesting. Yes, I think the role of Isaias, and how we should really comprehend how the Eritrean state functions is very important, which I was also very interested in. Before going to Professor Trenvoll, I remember having Professor Trenvoll in one of our discussions in Ethiopia when I was back at the MFA. We're doing a foreign policy review back in 2019, when almost everyone was, very much happy about the so-called peace process between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I remember Professor Trenvoll being very skeptical about all those things, because he had, of course, a very long knowledge of how the Eritrean state functions, how Isaias functions. So it would also be very interesting to hear from Professor Trenvoll on what guides Eritrea's foreign policy since its independence, at least until 2018. Over to you, Professor Trenvoll.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yes, we need a separate show on discussing Ethiopian foreign policy towards Eritrea, going back to that conference or that kind of workshop we did held together with the MFA and others. But that's another time. I think Mirjam is touching upon some key issues, and Martin, in the sense that this is not a country with a government which have developed and published its policies, be that its international relation foreign policy, its economic development policy, its cultural or defense policy for that matter. We don't have the standard documentation. We don't have the standard parliamentary debates. We don't have government white papers and other documentation to relate to in order to interpret, in order to analyze the basis for its decision-making process, its strategical choices, and so on and so forth. Eritrea, as stated by the two other speakers, doesn't operate as an ordinary state with a functioning government and a political party structure. Hence, it is more crossover to psychology and to interpretative anthropology, so to say, in order to understand how policy is formulated or what kind of choices are made by the regime. And the regime here is, yes, Isaias Afwerki plus a handful of other elderly men, which are not decision-making, which doesn't have decision-making authority themselves, but which are underpinning and trying to interpret and support whatever direction Isaias Afwerki are pointing towards, both from the civilian side and also the military side. Keep in mind that the party doesn't exist in Eritrea. PFDJ is just a structure on paper. It hasn't had any Congress for who gods know when. The parliament doesn't function. And the ministries, yes, they have ministers at the top and they have a bureaucracy, but they operate more on, how can I phrase it, trying to understand somehow oral interests articulated by the ministers, which reflects some kind of view Isaias have told them in some briefings. So when it comes to the international relation or foreign policy of Eritrea, it is basically upon what kind of interest does Isaias Afwerki himself see in maintaining relations to a country or to breaching relations with another country. We know he has played on and off with the Western states when it comes to development aid or input in such regard. 1 year he invites European Union or international NGOs to come to Eritrea to help formulate some kind of development strategies. The next year he throws them out again. We know he has played, for instance, the Middle Eastern states and the Arab League on and off for 2 decades, showing an interest to join Arab League, then going back again on that interest as an ad hoc strategy, an opportunistic strategy, what serves his interest in a more geopolitical context. The only thing predictable with Isaias Afwerki and with the international relations of Eritrea is its unpredictability, or his interest to create instability in the region in order for him to maneuver in that terrain. He is an expert to maneuver in the sea of instability. It's admirable how he thrives in such a context. And that's puzzling to internationals, particularly Western countries, but it's also a bit puzzling to its neighbors. As Mirjam, as you mentioned, when I was working closely with the Ethiopian MFA some years back, and I was also invited to some of the meetings in the MFA strategic board, so to say, to guide Ethiopian foreign policy. and meeting with the high-level ambassadors and experts in that committee. And when we were discussing Eritrea, I was invited on one occasion, particularly to discuss Eritrea with Ethiopian policymakers. And this was after TPLF left Addis Ababa, so there was no Tigrayan there, there was only other Ethiopians. And I was baffled by the fact that they didn't understand Eritrea at all. They didn't understand or know Eritrean history. They didn't know the agency of Isaias and his ideological underpinnings. So for Ethiopia under Abiy Ahmed, they were caught red-handed, so to say. They were played from day one by Isaias because they didn't have that kind of historical, empirical, political-based knowledge to interpret his interest in engaging then in the so-called peace accord with Ethiopia. And this is again premised on the fact that, you know, you need to have studied him individually and his acting throughout the last 30 or even more years in order to see that pattern, because it is not manifested in any policy document or in any white paper or in any Hansa Accord from the parliament, so to say, which makes Eritrea, as Mirjam and Martin says, a very, very unique case in the global international relations.
Yes, thank you. I think now that we have an overview of the genesis and the history of Eritrea's involvement and its relations with Ethiopia and Tigray, it's time for us to jump into Eritrea's role in the ongoing Tigray genocide. I think it's very important to see this from two perspectives, two angles. The first one being the role of Eritrea in engineering the entire war on Tigray. And one of the questions that really need deliberation, I guess, is who is in charge of Tigray genocide? What's the relationship between Isaias and Abiy? Who is leading who is one of the questions that really need to be interrogated and answered. And the second one in this context is what really explains, you know, the unprecedented level of atrocity, war crimes, the gang rapes, the looting, and the torching of towns that the Eritrean troops exceptionally commit in Tigray. And I have seen Professor Mirjam detailing the events that led to November 4 in one of the sessions, if I'm not wrong, at the European Parliament. So I will give the mic to Professor Mirjam. If it's possible, I think it would be good to start from the peace processes from 2018 all the way to November 4.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that Kjetil is making some very important points there to say that unless you have followed it for a very long time, it is very difficult to interpret. And it's true that we have seen new people coming into foreign ministries and diplomatic places, and then really starting from square one in trying to figure out something that for those who have lived it or those who are fortunate to follow it for a very long time seems like all the time a circle of repetition. So in that sense, I think it was quite astonishing to see the diplomatic world taking the peace agreement so seriously, in the sense that it appeared as a very cynical move, I would say, even at the time, and I think very worrying for many in terms of what that would mean in concrete terms. I think I'll leave it to Martin or Kjetil to say a little bit more about that period from 1918 to 2020 when the war started. But in that paper that you refer to, which I presented at the European Parliament, I really wanted to demystify the beginning, the origin of the war, because from the reconstruction that we made and the interviews that we had done, it was very clear that the preparations on the Eritrean side had started way before November the 4th, and that in fact Eritrea had crossed the border on November the 3rd already. And that means that the whole reason or raison d'etre for the war as somehow protecting the Northern Command from a TPLF attack does not stand. And that the war started with the sending of the commandos on November the 3rd to Mekelle to arrest the Tigray regional government has, I think, also been sufficiently described through different witnesses. So the order of the start of the war on, 2 years ago, around this time, has a different order and logic, and of course had also been prepared prior to that. And I leave it to my colleagues to speak about it. But I think it's very, very important to demystify the order and logic of the start of the war. Eritrea was in Tigray and had begun to invade Tigray even prior to the arrival of the commandos in Mekelle, who wanted to arrest the Tigray government. And then it would have, if that would have succeeded, it would have been a completely different story, because the government would have been arrested, and whatever the plan was between Isaias and Abiy would then have been carried out. So the thing that went different was that the Tigray regional government had the intelligence that they were waiting at the airport for the commandos. Fighting brought out. The government was not arrested, and well, the rest is history. But this could have been another scenario. It was planned. I think that is pretty obvious between Isaias and Abiy. And it was a direct result of whatever was discussed within those 2018 agreements. Yes. Let me yield to my colleagues. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Trenvoll and Mr. Plaut, one of you could proceed.
Well, shall I just come in, because I'm going to have to go fairly soon. I think that in order to see it, you have to look back, as Mirjam says, to the period in 2018 onwards. And although the first indication we have is that Prime Minister Abiy was trying to reach out to Isaias, once Isaias got the message and got the impression that there was genuinely an understanding that he wanted to end the cold peace that had prevailed since the end of the 1998 to 2000 war. Once he got that message, he then began thinking, what can I do? This is a young man. How can I use him to my ends? And when they then met in 2018 with that historic flight from Addis to Asmara, and the extraordinary welcome that he received in Asmara, and then the return visit by Isaias to Addis, again with very, very warm response, you begin to see a pattern developing. And the pattern has really two different elements to it. The first is that there's a gradual change from diplomatic relations to military relations. So that towards the end and in the weeks leading up to the war that broke out 2 years ago, you see the visits which are paid by both heads of state to their respective military bases. And this is a result of many, many meetings, both by the heads of state, but also by their junior ministers, all trying to build up this relationship. And the indication I think we have is of a clear idea that I think emanates from Isaias, of one which will sweep away the Tigrayans, who he sees as the one sort of pebble in his shoe, which he's trying to get rid of, has been trying to get rid of for years, which will allow him to then be in a position to take a dominant role in the Horn of Africa. And the second element is that there was this bringing in of the Somalis, with President Farmajo coming to Eritrea in, I think it was 2018, then a formal agreement 2020. And so that you got a three leaders, of whom Farmajo was obviously the junior one, who came together, and the Somali troops arrive in Eritrea, 5,000-10,000, we're not quite sure, prior to the outbreak of war. And they were supposed to be going to Oman. They never went there. They were, sorry, to the UAE, and they never went there. They were trained and they were put into the front line, and many of them died, and many of them behaved terribly badly in the conflict that broke out. So there was a clear plan before the conflict breaks out on the night of the 3rd and the 4th of November that Mirjam has talked about. And that is what the background to all of this is, and how we see this as playing out. The one thing I think we have to also, just, if I may, just if you'll just indulge me, the one thing one has to remember about Isaias is that he has no real interest in development. And this is a completely strange situation for a head of state. He has a huge interest in control and power, but he has no interest in development. I mean, he was asked, I think a year ago, what about the Eritrean economy? He said, what economy? We have no economy. It's nothing, absolutely nothing. But he really doesn't care. And, you know, in the end, if you want to understand the complete indifference that he has to it, you should go back to the great quote from George Orwell in 1984, which some of you may have read, when the victim in all of this says, why are you doing this? What is the final aim? And the quote that the oppressor comes up with is this. It is, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on the face of humanity forever. And that, in a funny kind of way, is the best way of understanding President Isaias, someone with utter no scruples of any kind, prepared to go to any length to maintain his control and extend the control that he has over the region. My apologies, I have to go. So I wish you well, and I'm sure that I leave you in safe hands with Kjetil and Mirjam. Good night.
Thank you, Mr. Plaut. Unfortunately, the next question before you leave, I was thinking about what the end game for Isaias was. Unfortunately, you have perfectly replied to that one. Thank you very much for joining us. We are sorry that you have to leave, but thank you for staying us this long as well. So back to you, Professor Trenvoll, on the two questions that we raised.
Yes, I think it is important to mention the precursor history before Isaias entered the game, so to say, with the war on Tigray. Because the war on Tigray was in the making long time before 2018, from the Ethiopian perspective. Already in 2015, we know that Amhara regional state blocked the main thoroughfares, the main roads into Tigray from Amhara, the Addis-Mekele route, and also from Gondar, was blocked, diverting then all traffic through the Afar route. And you had an increasing hostility within EPRDF component parties against TPLF. I've just published a lengthy article analyzing the so to say, the decline and breakup of EPRDF, where we have clear evidence for that the conflict was in the making from 2014, 2015, for sure. What made it more prominent, obviously, was the Eritrea Addis peace rapprochement, where Isaias Afwerki's role were compatible or overlapping with interest articulated by certain segments of the Ethiopian political elite, particularly some segments of the Amhara political elite, but also Oromo. And although, at least from my perspective, I cannot say that Abiy Ahmed entered into the peace agreement with the clear objective to go to war against TPLF. Not at that time in June 2018. I didn't think that happened. But very soon thereafter, Abiy Ahmed saw the overlapping objectives, so to say, with Isaias to marginalize or to use Isaias also to help him marginalize TPLF from the political arena of Ethiopia. So I don't think we should we should leave Abiy Ahmed out of that equation, that this is all about Isaias's agency. I think it goes hand in hand. Yes, the more shrewd role of planning and plotting certainly belongs to Isaias, but we have to keep in mind that the EPRDF minus TPLF and later converting into Prosperity Party had very clear objectives to take out TPLF as a relevant political actor in Ethiopia, and hence it was joining forces, so to say, with a common objective to neutralize TPLF as a political force. So I can see that this has the push for Isaias and the objectives we have today, both military and political objectives today, after 2 years of war, might be a bit different between Asmara and Addis. It is a tactical relationship, maybe not a strategic relationship, but they are equally involved in the war of Tigray, on Tigray. May I add, Merkeb and Mesa, just one thing, because I don't know how you phrased this in the opening of this seminar. I really think we need to distinguish between Isaias and his cronies, his mafia group, so to say, and the Eritrean people. Very much so, in terms of how they are relating to Ethiopia and Tigray. This is not to excuse the individual perpetration of war crimes in Tigray by Eritrean soldiers, but we also have to keep in mind that the Eritrean population for at least the last 20 years, since the crackdown, has been thoroughly brainwashed and has been thoroughly manipulated into believing that Tigray is the main cause for all their misery. And we know that the Eritrean population at a collective level is severely traumatized by the devastating human rights abuses which have occurred in Eritrea for 20, 30 years. And they have been dehumanized because they have seen their own brothers and sisters being tortured and killed by their own, and as such have been stunted, so to say, in how to relate to enemy forces also, and the neighboring Tigrayan people. I'm not excusing, but I'm trying to explain the situation also from the Eritrean side and the Eritrean troops being forced into carry out this war. And we should keep that in mind too.
Yes, thank you. I think that was also part of my question on how this level of atrocity, like probably historically unprecedented level of gang rape atrocities being committed in Tigray, and what explains that is also part of the question that we intended to look into. And thank you very much for your insights on that one. So moving forward, I think part of the question that both of you might want to answer also, in addition to Martin Plaut, is what the end game for Isaias in this war is. You have characterized the relationship as somewhat very tactical, but it's very important also to look into what Abiy is trying to achieve. But mainly, since our topic is Eritrea, what Isaias and his cronies are trying to achieve. Mr. Plaut has perfectly captured on how the relationship evolved from the diplomatic one into the military one. And all of you have spoken about how a few people control even the foreign policy, the diplomacy, and the security policy of Eritrea, with all the ministries having one minister. I think it's Professor Mirjam who read that one, and probably Martin Plaut as well. When the so-called détente started between Ethiopia and Eritrea, there were committees established to restart commercial relations, economic relations, and so on and so forth. So from the Ethiopian side, we had committees and committees of several experts from every ministry. But our counterparts from Eritrea was one old minister and one assistant with him. That's the entire ministry. And Ethiopians, most of the experts, as you said, were very junior guys who have never read anything about Eritrea, in charge of Ethiopia's relations with Eritrea. As you know, Ethiopia doesn't even have an ambassador in Asmara, and for several years, the people who are in charge of Ethiopia's embassy in Asmara are very junior folks who probably have never read any book authored by either of you. So those are very important factors as well in terms of Ethiopia's understanding towards Eritrea's policies towards the region, towards Tigray, and so forth. But what do you think is the end game for Isaias? Let me start with Professor Mirjam.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I first go back to that question that you were discussing, like how this fits within the broader policies also before 2018, I think what is important is that it's really indistinguishable what's happening on the Ethiopian side and on the Eritrean side. It needs another forum to discuss that. But obviously, the training camps on the Eritrean camp were there 10 years ago, in which Isaias was training Oromo and Amhara, etc., etc. So that this intervention and this way of intervening was there at that time and was part of the jigsaw puzzle that played into the complexity of the region. I think is important to recognize. But coming to your question of what can explain the sadistic violence that has been perpetrated, I think we first have to really understand how Eritreans are, and I think Professor Kjetil was alluding to that, are first of all victims of that. So this psychopathic regime of Isaias has created a situation in which really no one can trust anyone else, even within families. And as you probably know, I've studied the torture that happens in detention in Eritrea, but also how that then is organized within the human trafficking of Eritreans by, I would say, largely, again, Eritrean perpetrators in Sinai up to 2014, and since then, particularly in Libya. You find the same sadistic practices of total subjugation. People who have been thrown into holes in the ground and are kept there for years without knowing what for, when they will be released, etc. Complete dehumanization. That is the context in which people live and are terrified in Eritrea, but also outside Eritrea. That is why I started with the notion that this is cannot be considered as a country. This is a criminal organization, and the first victims of that criminal organization are the Eritreans themselves. The mobilization for the war has been equally terrifying. Villages burned down, people moved out of their houses, people forced into not just the national service, but the military service. Young people, old people moved to the front, and then being pushed forward with military behind them that shoot at them, and obviously military that they're facing who will also shoot at them. So as Kjetil says, this is not to say that that doesn't mean that there is responsibility and there should be accountability for the atrocities that have been committed. But we really have to understand what is at the heart of this. On top of that, people being given drugs that also prepares them to perpetrate. And as Kjetil also said, years of brainwashing that the source of the problems are in Tigray or are with somehow Tigrayan people, and the really, I would say, genocidal way of talking about Tigrayan people as non-humans. But in that context, the Eritrean people themselves are treated as non-humans as well. So it is a very difficult situation in which the Eritrean population, I would say, has been deeply traumatized really more than 20, 30 years. Even coming from the liberation itself was traumatized and really has not had any kind of normal circumstance of living for generations and generations now. So it's really very worrying, and it is very difficult to see any scenario out of this. But this is why, for me, I feel very clear that we can discuss ideology, we can discuss history, we can discuss complexity, but for me, there's only one first step that is necessary, and that is Isaias needs to be taken out of the equation. And only when that is the case can we start to begin to discuss our next steps of healing into the future, peace building, all of what will need to happen then. And that will be a very difficult road as well. But there also is hope, because I have often been surprised how young people that have actually really not been raised, that were born in a situation, in a society that is just crazy, and come out with such human values. And that means that that anyone and every one of us is able to tap into this spirit of humanity. And that means that even when we can take Isaias out of the equation, there's hope, and there will be, this will be the case one day, and there will be light at the end of the tunnel. But all I can say is that it will still be a very, very difficult road ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mirjam. I think the major takeaway here is taking Isaias out of the equation, part of our next question as well. But before that, we'll go back to Professor Trenvoll to to deliberate on these issues.
Yes, your question on what is Isaias's end game. I think that is a rolling script. Yes, we do know that he has a concrete objective to take out and exterminate the TPLF leadership strata, and possibly also all of TPLF as such. He also possibly have as an objective to a genocidal intent against Tigrayan people as such, at least to push Tigray back to the Stone Age, so to say, in terms of destroying infrastructure and properties in order for Tigray never to be any kind of developmental threat to Eritrean economic and political interests. But beyond that, what is Isaias's objective with Ethiopia as such? That is not that easy discernible, but we, again, based upon how he has acted over the last 30 years in relation to Ethiopian politics, I think we firmly can say that he doesn't want Ethiopia to be consolidated and prosper. He wants Ethiopia to be fragmented and weak in order for him and his Eritrea to play the determining role in the Horn of Africa. And Eritrea can never play a leading role in the Horn of Africa if Ethiopia puts their house in order, just because of the demographic, economic, political weight. Easy as that. So for Isaias, it is an objective to nurture and to funnel a continuous civil war in Ethiopia, also beyond Tigray. And we see that now, how he is playing versus the Amhara political leadership, bypassing Addis, how he is also relating to other political actors in Ethiopia beyond the palace in Addis, so to say. A divide and rule strategy in this regard. So, but again, this is a rolling script. He is continuously revising his tactics in order to further that division within Ethiopia. Sadly enough, the Ethiopian political elite doesn't seem to get it. They think he is a reliable so-called partner in the war against Tigray, and it will come back to bite them for sure. As Merkel mentioned when we were discussing this with the MFA in 2019, and I didn't understand at all the objectives of Isaias in this regard. So that we need to keep an eye on. I agree with Mirjam, obviously, that for any kind of change to happen in Eritrea, or in relation to the war on Tigray, or in relation to the development of Ethiopia, or in relation to the stability of the Horn of Africa, Isaias need to be taken out of the equation, as it is said. But that will be the first step. But what comes next? What is after Isaias is the big question, and I don't think anyone has a clear answer to that. How can we foresee a transition in Eritrea after Isaias? Who will take over? Will it be one of the four generals? Will it be Philippos? Will it be some of the others? The political side, I seriously doubt they have any clout. Yemane Monke is despised by everyone inside the party and inside Eritrea. Yemane Gebremeskel doesn't have that political authority. Saleh, the foreign minister, doesn't have it. You don't have anyone in the party which is kind of the second in command. It's Isaias, and that's it. Probably you will have a fragmented regime, and possibly a civil war in Eritrea after Isaias passes, or after Isaias is taken out, because you don't have a consolidated agreement within the military leadership or within the political strata at the top level. So it might turn to worse after Isaias before it is possible to stabilize and to kind of orchestra a transition. We know that the Eritrean forces in exile in diaspora is, of course, trying to present some alternatives. It is with great sadness I have observed the Eritrean diaspora political processes for 20 years, 25 years, that they have never managed actually to come together, to unite in a consolidated front and to present a reliable alternative to Isaias. That is also the sad consequence of what Mirjam said, the suspicion that everyone is afraid of Isaias's tentacles of espionage, and the divide and rule also Isaias is playing versus the Eritrean opposition, also played by Ethiopia and EPRDF. We shouldn't hide that for some time before the current situation. So I'm afraid that I'm not an optimist. Even if Isaias is taken out, it will still be a lot of hurdles, a lot of hoops to jump for Eritrea in order to stabilize and to provide some kind of negotiated transition. But in order to stop the war on Tigray, the first element will be to take Isaias out, because then the power relations will shift radically. As we know, it is the Eritrean military regime who is the military coordinating leadership on the war that Ethiopia has deployed and given away considerable numbers of their own troops to be put under the command of the Eritrean generals. So by changing the dynamics inside Eritrea, it will certainly also change the dynamics within Ethiopia when it comes to the war and political trajectories of Ethiopia too. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I think by taking Isaias out of the equation, it could mean at least two things. And the first one, at least that we are really concerned about, is taking Eritrea out of Ethiopia, out of Tigray, and the role of the international community in that. The attempts by the international community to use Herman Cohn's famous or infamous phrase to bring Eritrea in from the cold predated the coming of Abiy Ahmed to power, right? So there was a continuous attempt to bring Eritrea in from the cold, at least starting from 2012, 2013, all the way to the so-called peace process, the Nobel Peace Prize, and then the war on Tigray. And we see the international community continuously urging Eritrea to withdraw its troops from Tigray, but with no concrete measures towards that end. And one of the excuses that is used is that it is Isaias Afwerki is somehow insulated, that is very difficult for the international community to pressure Isaias to withdraw his forces from Tigray. But we know Eritrea is one of the 8 dependent countries. The international community could have a lot of leverage and a lot of tools and instruments that it could deploy to force Eritrea to withdraw from Tigray. So I want to hear your perspectives on what you think should the international community do to force Eritrea to withdraw its troops from Tigray. Back to Professor Mirjam, and then to Professor Trenvoll, and then Maaza will jump in between until I have a glass of water or something.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what really is important is that we have been able to emphasize here in the forum that there has really been so much of a misreading by the international community. I remember a long time ago, which I think was in 2008-9, when the European Commission had agreed this cooperation agreement with Isaias, and so in exchange there would be a release of a journalist, and the European Commissioner actually went on a call from Isaias on a plane to sign the agreement and to take the journalist home. Of course, he signed the agreement, but he never even got to see the journalist. So there is this fictional idea that it is possible to come to an agreement with Isaias that can somehow hold. And I think that many mistakes have been made in that sense. Trying to think that the European migration crisis somehow could be solved by going into an agreement with Isaias, whereas in fact Isaias is the major source of why Eritrean young people are leaving Eritrea and so on. So I think that there really is a misreading of the intention and also the way in which Isaias operates. What I find really difficult is that the level of atrocities that are being committed and that have been committed are of a nature that are way beyond any mark that could be acceptable according to international norms and standards. And I find it very, very difficult to see that this is still somehow treated as a government, as a head of state with whom it is somehow legitimate to deal with. We are not accepting that in the context of Ukraine, speaking from a European context, and we shouldn't find it normal in the context of the Horn. But the thing that is worrying me most of all is that I think that Isaias just wants one thing, and that is the total surrender of Tigray. And this is something that I think is a big, big concern as we are trying to understand what kind of progress is being made today at the negotiation table in South Africa. And in that sense, I really appreciate this forum here tonight. And I think that we need to consider the small steps of the day and not lose ourselves in big conversations about what might happen after. The big problem of the day is how we do get Eritrea out of Tigray, out of Ethiopia, and how we can start from there a path of peace building and reconstitution also within the Ethiopian context, whatever that may be. But the first step has to be to get Eritrea out of the war in Tigray.
Yes, I think what can the international community do versus pressuring Isaias to pull back the troops, you asked, Merkel. I think I have to beg to differ with your initial remarks there. I think it is very little the international community can do in this regard, because we know over 30 years of observing international community's relations to Eritrea and Isaias, that they have very little sway over the agency of Isaias. And Eritrea doesn't receive that much development aid, actually. Yes, a lot is pledged, a lot is given on paper, but very little is utilized in Eritrea. So, and to use development aid, which we have tried, or the Western countries have tried over the years, have never been successful. More confrontational foreign policy and threats have to, on certain occasions, proved more impactful. But the best, I think, and again, this goes back to also what Mirjam said, that Western diplomacy, foreign ministries in Europe and in Washington have never managed to really understand Isaias and Eritrea, because they haven't invested in continuous analysis of him. So every new ambassador arriving in Asmara think that he or she will manage to talk him into liberalizing, talk him into become a social democrat, as I ridicule the Scandinavians who have been trying to do that for 30 years. Even before the war with Ethiopia in 1998-2000, we saw clearly that the developments in Eritrea were on the wrong path already in 1993, 1994, 1995. And then when I tried to warn at least Scandinavian governments at that time, I was just brushed aside, saying that I was a stupid young man who didn't really understand anything about development. But we saw very clearly how it was wrong already before the war, and certainly also after 2001. Isaias never had any intention to democratize or to liberalize independent Eritrea from 1991 or 1993. And the international influence to try to put him on the right path, so to say, of liberalization has been minuscule from day one. And basically, you know, again, Eritrea doesn't operate, as we have said over and over again, doesn't operate as an ordinary state in international relations. We just have to face that fact and see then, okay, if we cannot influence him, how can we contain him? How can we contain Eritrea and Isaias to not become a spoiler in Tigray and Ethiopia and in the region as such? To try to pressure him to pull back troops from Tigray, I don't think will happen. They will only pull back when they are facing defeat on the battlefields. That might happen again, as we saw last year in Operation Alula. Eritrea was very quick to pull back its troops before ENDF did, because they didn't want to sacrifice the troops in face-to-face battle with the TDF. And they didn't want to come to rescue for ENDF. They rather pulled back to save their own troops. That might happen again if the TDF gets the upper hand in the fighting. That's the only way, as I see it, that they can pull back. Even Abiy Ahmed doesn't have the power to ask Isaias to pull back his troops, as we also know over the last 2 years. So the only thing which can change that is battlefield victory by TDF. But beyond, you know, we need to think, although how devastating the current war is for Tigray, we need to think beyond that too. And there, in that time frame, the international community should really start to redesign their policies versus Eritrea and Isaias with a very, very strict containment strategy, and of course a support for any Eritrean actor, movement, political platform, whatever, who might want to change the regime from within. Because basically it is up to the Eritrean people to change the government. It is not up to EU or US to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, both Professor Kjetil and Professor Mirjam. Until Merkab comes back, I'll just give a general overview of our discussion today. We're talking about Eritrea's involvement in the ongoing genocidal war against the people of Tigray, particularly because the Eritrean government has been involved not only in the extermination of Tigrayans by breaching all relevant international and local rules, but also in the designing of the genocidal war. This is to mean that Eritrean troops and their state apparatus has been fully engaged in finding ways to effectively blockade the region Tigray from the international community, ensuring that the international world doesn't really get to see what exactly the allied forces of Ethiopia and Eritrea are doing to the innocent people in Tigray. This discussion is not only to highlight the plight of the Tigrayan people, but also to have a meaningful and detailed discussion regarding Eritrea's role in destabilizing the Horn of Africa and beyond. Because ever since the coming of Isaias Afwerki to power some 30 years ago in Eritrea, Eritrea as a state have had a lot of conflicts and border-related issues, not only with Ethiopia, but also with other neighboring countries. And so in our discussion, what we're trying to understand today is that if the Eritrean government, aka Isaias Afwerki and his cliques, are really acting on the best national interest of Eritrea and the people themselves. I think our speakers have clearly stated that the Eritrean people themselves are victims of the dictatorial and brutal and authoritarian leadership of Isaias that continues to inflict unmeasurable level of pain to the people of Tigray at the moment. And so in this kind of situation, then what should the international community do? Because we have seen endless statements, we have seen endless efforts to use diplomacy towards not only pulling Isaias out of Tigray, but also to bring about change in their own country. And none of that seems to work. And I wonder if both speakers could actually answer to that question in relations to the ongoing peace efforts in South Africa. One, what is your expectation from those peace talks? And in the event that there is no any positive outcome that would in effect force Isaias to withdraw his forces from Tigray, what other options should the international community consider in order to avert further catastrophe in Tigray, but also to ensure that Isaias leadership doesn't continue to present or pose serious security and peace-related concerns to the Eritrean people, to Ethiopians at large, and also Africans? Thank you. Maybe we can start with Professor Mary.
Well, thank you very much, Miasa. These peace talks are really extremely important. There might not be another opportunity very soon again. It's very, very important. And as I just said, I would say that the objective of Isaias is the complete surrender of Tigray. So what is really very important for what I'd say for the people of Tigray is, first of all, that the blockade is lifted. It's very, very necessary for so many reasons. Isaias will let the people starve as he has done with the Eritrean people. That we can be sure of. The outcome of the negotiations must be, first of all, a ceasefire, but that will also not be enough. There must be a kind of a peacekeeping mechanism that will ensure that Eritrean troops are moved out, and which would then contribute to what Kjetil is correctly saying should be a policy of containment of Isaias and of Eritrea, but which also ultimately must lead to accountability of Isaias, of the crimes committed against the people of Tigray, but also against the Eritrean people. So in South Africa, ceasefire first, and then some sort of a peacekeeping mechanism that will enforce that, including on the Eritrean troops, Miasa.
Yes, to take the talks in South Africa first, I think we should be, let's start with at least the only element which is positive is that they are still talking, that they continued the talk beyond the time frame originally set, which means that there are a certain interest to see the possibility of coming to some kind of compromise. But this isn't peace talks yet. This is talks for cessation of hostilities. And I think, as we know, the objective, well, the Tigrayan regional government have stated their objective with the talks through Ambassador Fesseha in Brussels, who issued a statement at the beginning of the talk saying that the objective is to, well, a cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access, and also access to Tigray for journalists and human rights observers to document the atrocities being committed against the Tigrayan people. I don't think that will happen. We know the objectives of the Ethiopian government would, they didn't believe in these talks to start with. They had an objective to take Mekele, to capture Mekele before the talks, and basically have a meeting of surrender with TPLF. And I think that's still the objective of the Ethiopian government. It is to negotiate a surrender of TPLF. And not anything beyond that. We haven't reached what is called the mutually hurting stalemate yet, which is a phase in a kind of conflict resolution theory, where both sides have come to the awareness that this cannot be settled on the battlefield, that no one will win militarily over the other, or at least the cost of doing so is too high. I think that realization has been undertaken in Mekele, that they have realized the cost for the Tigrayan people at large to continue as is might be too high. So they want to reach some kind of settlement. That knowledge, that awareness hasn't reached Addis yet. We know that Abiy quite recently said that they, due to the demographic weight of Ethiopia, they could produce 1 million soldiers each year to train and deliver, so to say, to the battlefronts. The attrition rate in Ethiopia, when it is about 120 million people, even though a couple of 100,000, to be brutal, is killed every year in the war, is acceptable. That is not an acceptable casualty number for Tigray. So Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government is also torn between the multiple objectives of the belligerent parties on their side. The Amhara regional special forces, the Amhara militia, the Fano irregular militia, they have different objectives with this war than Addis. Asmara and EDF involvement have different objectives with this war than Addis. So even though if a miracle goes through that Addis Ababa will accept a cessation of hostilities agreement and will accept unimpeded humanitarian access to Tigray, that will not be accepted by the Amhara regional government, neither by Eritrea. So I have to say I'm a pessimist that these negotiations will not manage to produce a compromise which is sustainable to carry the process forward into a ceasefire agreement and then carry the process forward into a peace negotiation process to hammer out the comprehensive peace agreement, which is needed. And that is a peace agreement not only involving the Tigray regional authorities, but should also include OLA and other forces in Ethiopia. I think it is, we are not even seeing the first hour of this process, so to say, to manage to come to that kind of all-inclusive compromise in Ethiopia. Basically because both sides, or all four sides, Amhara, Eritrea, Addis, and certainly Tigray, they interpret this as a more or less existential war towards their own objectives. Certainly so from Tigray. They know if they lay down their arms now and surrender, they will be killed off. Not only the political elite, but also the ordinary people will suffer dramatically in the hands of Eritrea, Amharas, and the Ethiopian government. So for many Tigrayans, I believe it is better to die fighting than to die in prison, so to say, as a metaphor. The Abiy Ahmed regime, he has objectives of where he wants to take Ethiopia and what he wants to do with Ethiopia. Tigray and TPLF is an obstacle to fulfill that vision. And we know that Abiy Ahmed believes that he has a mandate from God. He is on a divine mission to transform Ethiopia. And to have that mandate means that he can sacrifice quite a lot to reach that mandate. We have talked about Isaias and his interest, and also from the Amhara political elite side, the territorial issues, the territorial component of the war on Tigray, talking about Western Tigray and Raya, is also interpreted or at least articulated as an existential issue for the new reinvigorated Amhara nationalism. And viewing these four key belligerent parties then, and their different objectives and their different motivations to continue fighting, that is too strong, or that motivation is stronger than the interest to try to reach a compromise, as far as I see it today. The second element of the question, if I can just conclude on that, what can be done with Isaias Afwerki in the situation as it is now in terms of accountability? Well, again, very little, because we know the Security Council is hamstrung. The Security Council cannot reach any kind of decision which might make a referral of Isaias and the regime to the ICC, for instance. That is blocked by China and Russia. And also any other resolution on Ethiopia or on Eritrea is blocked by China and Russia, and also the African states in the Security Council. So an international accountability regime, it seems far-fetched. Yes, we do have the possibility of much more coordinated sanctions, targeted sanctions on Eritrea, not UN Security Council sanctions, but bilateral US sanctions, EU sanctions, and other bilateral countries can decide on that, so to say, in order to try to pressure some kind of change again in Eritrea, and further on some hope of accountability. You also have, as Mirjam knows quite well, obviously, the possibility, since we are talking about atrocity crimes and possibly genocide. In my view, there is a genocide, but that has to be decided by a court to be affirmed. Individual jurisdiction of states, transnational jurisdiction from Netherlands and from other countries, can actually prosecute charges of genocide against Eritrea and against Ethiopia in their own judicial systems. So hopefully that will be picked up by a bold European country in the near future, if nothing happens on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Trenvoll. I think, as you said, you seem a bit pessimistic, if not realistic, about the talks in South Africa, and whether Eritrea will want to withdraw. One of not only the demands of the government of Tigray, but also the international community, is for Eritrea to withdraw from Tigray, and that's one of the objectives of the peace talks in South Africa. You don't seem to have hopes on that one, but in the unlikely scenario of Ethiopia agreeing to that demand, what effective instruments do you think could be employed by both the international community and Ethiopia and Tigray to verifiably force Eritrea to withdraw? So with that question, I will conclude. So we will have to see the kind of the targeted sanctions, the international jurisdictions, and ultimately the battlefield defeats that will force Eritrea to withdraw from Tigray, that Professor Trenvoll has mentioned. But ultimately, in the unlikely scenario of Ethiopia agreeing to the withdrawal of Eritrea, what kind of instruments do you think the international community could employ to force Eritrea to withdraw verifiably? And if Ethiopia and Eritrea do not agree to the withdrawal of Eritrea from Tigray on these peace talks, how do you think the international community will respond to that? So over to you, Professor Mirjam.
Thank you. Great question. I think it is not a question of either or. I really most sincerely hope that the talks will conclude a cessation of hostilities. And as I said, that needs to be accompanied by an understanding that Eritrea must leave Tigray and the mechanisms to enforce that. But over and beyond that, and in parallel to that, whatever the outcome, I think that we need to understand how Eritrea is really connected together with Russia to a anarchy of the world order, and this is something that really has consequences over and beyond the region. And in that sense, I think, speaking from an EU perspective, that the involvement of Eritrea supporting Russia in the UN is something that should be understood better and analyzed better, and the consequences of that should be much clearer. And the logical way forward on that is that there must be much stricter sanctions. The US has already gone quite far with its sanctions. Europe is lagging behind. And these sanctions, they should involve the 2% diaspora tax. That is a big source of income. It's an illegal tax. It is part of the system of extortion and threats of the diaspora in foreign countries. We have seen movement. Yesterday, Lord Alston presented a report in the UK. And we have also seen that the German courts are no longer accepting that any papers are used in the courts that are delivered through the embassies where this 2% tax is being raised, but also the PFDJ businesses, the minerals. This should, as the UN monitoring group has been recommending for a long time, this should really be now looked at. I take the parallel with the blood diamonds that were fueling the war in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And at some point, we came to grip that in order to get the sting out of the war, we need to follow the money, and we need to follow the illegal criminal businesses that allow this war to continue. And this should be part of an integrated package through which Eritrea is contained. We also know from experience that Isaias does respond to such kind of pressure. So it is a rational thing to do. But of course, the most important thing is that in South Africa, a cessation of hostilities is agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mirjam. Over to you as the final remark, Professor Trenvoll.
Yes, thank you. So let's then hypothetically say that the talks in South Africa will reach an agreement on cessation of hostilities, and Addis Ababa asks Asmara to pull back the troops from Tigray. Do you think that will happen? Most likely not. You know, even up until today, Ethiopian government hasn't fully publicly recognized that Eritrea is part of the war, so to say, fighting inside Tigray. And they were in denial for a long time, even though everyone knew it. So if Isaias hesitates to pull back troops, even if Abiy tells him to do so, Ethiopia then has to reclassify Eritrea from an ally into an enemy. And they have to notify UN that Eritrea is a belligerent party to Ethiopia. And hence the conflict will be reclassified as an international armed conflict, which then will increase very much the responsibility, so to say, of the UN Security Council also to take action. Because so far, the conflict is not classified as an international armed conflict. Do you foresee that if Abiy says that Eritrea, Isaias, is the enemy of Ethiopia, that is to give the Trump card to Mekele, and it will change and alter the power dynamics in Ethiopia fundamentally? Because if Eritrea is an enemy of Ethiopia, well, then ENDF has to fight Eritrea, not Tigray. I seriously doubt that scenario will happen. So if you do reach a cessation of hostilities agreement in South Africa, I doubt it, but if you do, and if Abiy Ahmed will tell Isaias to pull back troops, he will not. Yes, he might pull back from possibly Aksum, possibly even Shire, but he will still be on Tigrayan soil, so to say, on Ethiopian soil, as we have seen over the last 2 years. So it will still be an uncleared situation in this regard. And it is very little Ethiopia can manage to do about that, other than to make Eritrea an enemy, which will then indicate a possible re-altering of power relations in Ethiopia, and that will not be in favor of the Prosperity Party and Abiy Ahmed. And I sincerely wish I'm wrong in my interpretations here. I sincerely wish that they will reach a cessation of hostilities, which will go into a ceasefire, which will merge into a peace talks later on. But as Merkel, you know, I'm a realist, and in this regard, that means to be a pessimist. So the international community needs to prepare for the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is a continued genocide on the Tigrayan people. And what should the international community do about that now? Not wait until later. We need to act now. And there, on that issue, I don't see EU, I don't see US acting at the level they should be. We know, for instance, that the US State Department have a legal brief to classify what's happening as a genocide, but they don't want to release it. And they've held back that for several months in hope to facilitate a peace process. I think this, as Mirjam says, what's happening in South Africa now is possibly the final attempt. And if it breaks down in South Africa, the talks, it will take a long time before that might resume, so to say. Then it is a full concentration on battlefield victory. And then also the international community needs to rethink the overall relationship with Ethiopia, not only with Eritrea, but with Ethiopia, how to sanction Ethiopia, how to put weapons embargo on Ethiopia and Eritrea, how to possibly help the Tigrayan people to defend themselves from a genocide in terms of humanitarian, but also possibly other resources to defend themselves. Not that we are taking the fight for them. But look how we are helping Ukraine with everything they need in their war against the Russian invading troops. We should start to think alternative scenarios now in case the talks will fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Trenvoll. Those were very powerful and insightful comments. Lastly, that we don't have time, that the international community needs to rethink strategy of engagement both with Ethiopia and Eritrea, that it needs to act, and the alternative scenarios that you have put forward in terms of helping Tigrayans defend themselves, both in humanitarian and other aspects, is very insightful and critical. And thank you, Professor Mirjam. and Martin Plaut also for joining us. Thank you everyone tonight for joining us. We have had very insightful, very sober, and of course intellectual discussions. I personally couldn't have asked for better experts on the issue. I hope we have all learned a lot of things from tonight's engagements. Having said that, I will pass the mic to Maza. Maza will wrap up the discussions. She will also tell us about the next sessions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, Professor Kjetil, Professor Mirjam, and Martin Plaut for making the time to be here today with us. I know you guys are extremely busy, all of you, but you cared enough to come here and share your expertise and opinion on one of the most critical topics of the Horn of Africa, really. So we're truly grateful. And for everyone else that also made the time to be here to listen and to get further knowledge on Eritrea as a state and its role in destabilizing Africa and what steps should be taken by the international community. I hope the educated opening that you have heard today will inform your work going forward, particularly journalists and academicians and policymakers who were here with us today. Having said that, the main reason why, like I said earlier, the main reason why we wanted to organize this discussion today is to commemorate the second year of the beginning of the ongoing Tigray genocide that has been waged not only by the Ethiopian state but also by Eritrea. The ongoing genocidal war against the people of Tigray has been really unique in its sense. The fact that you have two nation states that are employing all of their state apparatus to exterminate a small group of people. And it's for that reason that we today exclusively focused on Eritrea, because Eritrea didn't only send its troops to rape the Tigrayan women, to kill the Tigrayan men, and to burn Tigrayan houses, as we see it and continue to see it in videos that were proudly captured by members of these allied forces. But Eritrea has also been involved from the very beginning with regards to designing what has unfolded since November 4th of 2020. So it's for that particular reason that we exclusively focused on Eritrea, and we're truly grateful for the experts that have furthered our understanding of Eritrea as a state and what the international community needs to do in order to avert further catastrophe. Having said that, I am also unfortunately very much pessimistic about what's happening in South Africa, which is why it makes it even more relevant for the international community to be realistic themselves and consider employing the carrot end of diplomacy and not the stick end of the diplomacy and not the carrot. I think the inaction of the international community has emboldened not only Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, but also Isaias of Eritrea into committing the level of atrocities that his troops have been committing against the people of Tigray. That being said, I once again thank everybody and would like to bring to your attention that we are organizing more panel discussions. Tomorrow we'll have another incredible line of speakers, including none other than Tadal Lamma and Tumnit Gabru. So I encourage everybody to come and join us back tomorrow at the same time. We will put out a flyer and we'll continue having similar discussions all the way to November 5th. And we have incredible line of speakers, like I said, that will discuss issues of importance not only to the people of Tigray, but to humanity at large. But for today, thank you everybody. Thank you for making the time, and we appreciate you all. See you all tomorrow.
لو طغينا مسكن نوفلنا نفرح يبلنا كنتبع لنا سبسي أي تفرح نحق فرح نزقيها فرح